I know I've shared this with you often with this group, but I'll share it once more. This woman that was at Mass when this gospel was read, right? And she went home and her husband was there watching TV or doing something, and she walks in and she hugs him and dances with him and lifts him up and swings him around, and he's like, "What happened to you?" He says, "Well, at church, the priest told us that we should embrace our cross with joy." Right, whoever wishes to come after you must take up his cross. So continue to embrace each other. Remember that your spouse is your path to heaven. So it behooves all of us to embrace our path to heaven. Isn't that right? And I'm going to say something even crazier. I am a big fan and a big promoter of sin. And I'll explain that in a little second, in a bit, just so you don't fall asleep. Jesus and Jeremiah are going through two similar moments. Right? Jeremiah is a prophet from about the 500s before Christ. And he was given the God-given task to warn, as many prophets were, to warn, to advise, to call to conversion, just as Jesus was doing. Right? There were corrupt leaders that did not want to hear his message, very similar to what happened during Jesus' time. They were spreading lies about Jeremiah. Right? When you don't like what someone does and you're corrupt, well, then you begin to spread lies. And he was falsely accused. They put him in prison a few times. And there was a moment also in his life when the false prophets took him and they threw him into an old well that was full of mud. Right? And then there's other time the king called Jeremiah, called him and he told him, "Write down on a scroll, write down all your prophecies." And he did that. And then the king took that and he read it off, and he was infuriated. So he ripped it up, threw it in the fire, and then arrested Jeremiah. So of course Jeremiah is like in this moment in the reading where he's like, "I can't do this anymore." And then Jesus in the gospel, he begins to tell his disciples. And everything we said about Jeremiah sounds familiar, right? When we think about Jesus. About lies being spread, about being accused, of being put in prison, when he was put in the pit as well, during Holy Thursday night. And so Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem to fulfill the prophets, to fulfill the will of the Father, and to fulfill his mission, which he is very passionate about, but it doesn't make it easy. And so Jeremiah, that's why this reading comes in that context. I'm trying to be faithful to what you called me to do, but holy smokes, it's so hard. And we have moments in our lives when we're like, why is this happening to me? I'm just trying to be good. I'm trying to do things right. Why is this? And so in just a few paragraphs, Jeremiah brings us through what he's going through. And he says, "Lord, you duped me, you deceived me, but I allowed myself to be duped, to be deceived, because I wanted to serve you. So I willingly allowed this to happen to me, but I've become an object of laughter. Everyone laughs at me and mocks me. Whenever I'm trying to be faithful, I become a laughing stock of those around me. A sign of contradiction." And then he says, "I could take the easy way. I say to myself inside, I'm not going to talk about him anymore. I'm not going to prophesize anymore. I won't speak his name anymore." We could all take the easy way. And sometimes we have those moments, right? Like, just take the easy way. But then something wells up within him that says, like a burning fire in his heart, a voice that he cannot quiet, that I need to continue to preach, to continue to prophesy, continue to preach conversion, to continue to bring people back to the Lord. And in all of us, that has different manifestations as well, whether it be in a relationship, in a marriage, in a family, or in doing the right thing. There's something that wells up with us of a passion, a fire that's burning, that I want to continue to love. I want to continue to be faithful, although fidelity brings challenges. And so we see that then with Jesus. He begins last week this happens just a few minutes after what we read last week. Remember what we read about last week was when Jesus said to Peter, Simon, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Right? And so Peter was like, he was feeling all good about himself, wasn't he? He was like, ooh. And then Jesus, right after that, he begins to tell them, now we're going to Jerusalem, right? This is a long journey to Jerusalem, and we're going to go there. And he says, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to suffer greatly. The elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, they're going to take me prisoner. They're going to kill me. And on the third day, I will be raised. And Peter is like, Lord, that is not going to happen. No such thing shall ever happen to you. Peter says this out of a place, I'm sure, of love, right? But he had his vision of what Jesus was going to be and what Jesus was going to do. But Jesus and God had a different vision. And this is also important, that we don't get in each other's way in their journey towards holiness, towards heaven. And sometimes we can get in people's way from a place of love. Sometimes we can get in people's way from a place of not so much love. But we can get in people's way out of a place of love. Like, oh, you don't have to do that. And sometimes that's not helpful because someone's like, yeah, I know I don't have to, but I feel called to do this. And it would be the honest thing to do. It would be the good thing to do. Right? Because God's voice, God's will, and how it expresses itself in our hearts is something so personal. And oftentimes it's not easy. So Peter, I think he speaks up from a place of love, but from a place also of not understanding. It was sort of misplaced, his comment. And so from being that rock, that building block, all of a sudden he becomes a stumbling block. And that's why Jesus stands up. And what we can learn from Jesus is that he is so convinced, his conviction, and he is so decisive that he says, get behind me, Satan. So Peter, who had been the rock, all of a sudden is called Satan. Not because he's Satan, but because he was getting in the way. And Jesus teaches us how to deal with temptation, because this was a temptation for Jesus. Do you think he was feeling great about going to Jerusalem and going through all this? No, not at all. But again, there was a fire and a passion in his heart that this is what he had to do and this is what he wanted to do. And he's so decisive. And he teaches us how to be decisive with temptation. Sometimes we sort of dance with temptation, right? Because temptation oftentimes is attractive. And when Peter said, Lord, you don't have to do this, that was attractive for Jesus. And so sometimes we do a little dance with temptation because temptation is always attractive. But Jesus is decisive. Now, why did I say what I said about why am I a big fan of sin and of challenges? I am because what it does for Peter, it does for all of us. God never expects us to be perfect and not to be without sin as part of our lives. Now, I'm not a fan of people hurting each other. But we all go through this, and this, for Peter, all of his mistakes and his sins and his failures in life were so grounding. They made him humble. In my life as a priest of 18 years, thousands and thousands of confessions, and that's why I came to this conviction. Sin can lead to such beautiful things. Because sin leads us to go on our knees. Pride leads us to always stand up. Sin leads us, and repentance leads us to name what we're going through, to name our challenges, to name our difficulties, to name our failures, to name the things that I don't like about myself or about my life. And pride silences all of that. Sin with hope leads to repentance and to forgiveness, to mercy and salvation, which is why Jesus came. And pride is a wall that doesn't allow any of that to happen. So that's why I'm a big fan, not just of sin in and of itself, but when sin is a path to salvation. when sin is a path to mercy and to redemption, because that's why Jesus came. And so Jesus says to him, you are an obstacle. You are thinking not as God thinks, but as human beings think. And then we have, and that's sort of what I think of the horizontal way we think and the vertical, right? The cross. Yes, we think as human beings think, but it's so important to always remember, also think how God thinks. And that's why what St. Paul says in his reading, he says, be transformed in the renewal of your mind, that you may discern what is the will of God, that you may discern what is good, what is pleasing, and what is perfect. In other words, Peter allows his mind, his way of thinking, he allows it to be evangelized by Jesus. And that he did that every step of the way, through Calvary into the resurrection. And we too have to do the same, to allow our way of thinking to constantly be evangelized. In our own lives, we still notice prejudice in the way we think, in the way we look at other people, judgment. We all need our mind to constantly be evangelized by Jesus.